Thinking back, way back, I think I first got curious when I asked, hey, what about that Suzy girl? I like her. I remember looking her up on Facebook. You didn't know much about Facebook at the time. I was the one showing you things. And you said, oh, she's a pretty girl. Just like that. Innocent enough. But what if the truth we thought we knew, what we were told, wasn't the whole truth? What if it was just half the story? That question came back to me hard when this letter turned up. A letter written by Joni Lamb's own son-in-law, Jonathan Weiss. Yeah, that Jonathan. Rebecca's husband. The same family that had been keeping the public face so calm, so confident for years. But this letter, it changes everything. It's not hearsay. It's not blog gossip or third-hand chatter. It's written proof from inside the house. For months, no, years, Joni stuck to her version of things. She told the world there was no proof against Pete. Said her son, Jonathan Lamb, and his wife, Suzy, were just bitter, spreading lies. The whole narrative painted them as the rebellious ones, the outliers, two disgruntled family members out on their own. But this letter, it blew that whole story apart, because it wasn't just Jonathan and Suzy anymore. Jonathan Weiss was inside, a son-in-law, a spiritual leader in his own right. And according to people who've seen the letter, what he described, what he saw with his own eyes, involved Pete acting in ways that made him sick. That crossed lines, inappropriate physical behavior, around a child, their child, Jonathan and Suzy's daughter. That's not the version Joni shared on TV. She talked about heartbreak and marital failure and restoring trust. But this wasn't just moral failure. It wasn't just a broken marriage. It was something else. And what made it even harder to swallow was the timing. Because for years, Daystar, Joni, had told us all, only Jonathan and Suzy had concerns about Pete. Only they ever made accusations. They were cast as outliers, emotionally unstable, maybe even trying to sabotage the ministry. But this letter proved otherwise. If Weiss, another family member, saw something firsthand, then it wasn't just two people out for revenge. It meant more people knew. Maybe more people saw. And yet, it stayed hidden. What's haunting is that Jonathan Weiss didn't just write the letter. He initially said he'd testify, said he'd support Jonathan and Suzy in court. But then, silence. He pulled back. He refused to hand the letter over to the police, just vanished from the front lines. And everyone started asking, why? Was it pressure? Family loyalty? Fear of blowing up the ministry? Protecting reputations over protecting a child? That part, no one knows for sure. But the damage was done. Once word of the letter got out, people who had followed Daystar for years, watched it faithfully, tithed, prayed, started to wonder, what else has been kept from us? Because this wasn't just a plot twist. It was a reckoning. This wasn't a rumor. It was a first-hand account from someone inside that contradicted everything the public had been told. People began saying that Joni's version of events couldn't hold water anymore, that she knew more, that she covered more, and that maybe, just maybe, the silence was part of something darker than denial. It was protection. And so now I think back to that moment. What about Suzy? I like her. Back when everything felt lighter, simpler, when a Facebook picture could tell a story. But we know now, pictures lie, smiles lie, ministries lie, letters don't. Not when they come from inside the house. You could feel it, that shift, when the letter came out. It wasn't just another layer to the story. It was a hole in the trust. People began to realize that the official version of events, the polished, press-ready story, wasn't just one side of the truth. It was something crafted, tailored, designed to protect images, reputations, and specific people. For a long time, folks believed this was just a messy family dispute, hurt feelings, maybe betrayal. But the day that letter surfaced, all of that changed, because suddenly it wasn't just Jonathan and Suzy's word against the ministry anymore. There was another voice now, a voice from someone who had been in the room, who had seen enough to write it down. That letter rewrote the boundaries of the whole story. See, from the beginning, Joni Lamb stood firm, publicly, unapologetically, behind Pete. She said Jonathan and Suzy were the only ones making accusations, as if they were lashing out or didn't understand. And for a while that worked. It was easy to dismiss them as bitter or divisive when they were the only ones speaking up. But when Joni's own son-in-law, Jonathan Weiss, put his concerns into writing, that picture cracked wide open. His letter made it undeniable. The narrative that only two family members had problems with Pete wasn't true. Weiss, along with his wife Rebecca, Joni's daughter, had witnessed things, had questions, had concerns. And what made it even harder to ignore was that this wasn't coming from outsiders or critics of the ministry. This was family, people who were supposed to be on the same side. Weiss wasn't vague in that letter. He didn't hedge. People who've seen it say he gave examples, specific ones, of how Pete had acted inappropriately toward Jonathan and Suzy's young daughter. Not just questionable, wrong. Kissing her, hugging her in ways that didn't sit right with him. He didn't call it a misunderstanding. He called it out for what it was. And at the time, it mattered enough to him to write it down and send it to Daystar's board, to take that risk, to speak into the silence. There's more. People close to the situation say that back then, both Jonathan Weiss and Rebecca told Jonathan and Suzy they would stand with them if it went to court, that they would testify, back them up. And their account in those early days matched exactly what Jonathan and Suzy had been saying all along. They weren't uncertain. They weren't holding back. They were ready to speak. But then something changed. The support disappeared. The fire faded. And when the police came asking for a copy of the letter, Weiss refused to hand it over. Just like that, the voices that once said, "We're with you," went quiet. And from the outside, it looked like the exact opposite of what had once been promised. Why? That's the question people still can't shake. Was it fear? Pressure from family? A desire to shield Daystar from public damage? No one outside the circle truly knows. But the silence? It's loud, and it raises hard questions about just how much influence was being wielded behind closed doors. Still, the fact remains. This wasn't just about two voices anymore. If Joni's own daughter and son-in-law saw things that troubled them, if they had private conversations that matched Jonathan and Suzy's account, then the whole story changes. You can't brush that off as a personal vendetta. You can't call it rebellion or slander. You have to admit, this wasn't isolated. This was a pattern, a troubling one. But even after all that, Joni's public statements haven't changed. She continues to claim that Pete was only ever a problem for Jonathan and Suzy, that no one else ever saw anything. But when you hold that claim next to the facts, the letter, the early promises, the corroborating accounts, it simply doesn't hold up. To believe the official story now, you'd have to erase everything that Jonathan Weiss wrote. Forget the conversations he and Rebecca are said to have had. Pretend there were no other witnesses. That kind of erasure isn't just misleading. It's a betrayal to the people who believed in Daystar, who believed in the Lamb family. Because when leadership willingly silences voices inside their own family to preserve a clean public image, it raises the inevitable question. What else have they changed? What else have they hidden? When the most damning testimony comes not from enemies but from those who were supposed to be allies, that's not just strange, it's devastating. It calls into question every public denial, every rehearsed defense, every staged smile on camera. Because the truth, when it's inconvenient, tends to get buried. But not this time. Not completely. Jonathan Weiss's letter still exists. The concerns Rebecca once voiced are still out there, even if unspoken now. The story, no matter how carefully it's curated, can't explain away the facts. It can't erase the witnesses, and it definitely can't change the reality that the people contradicting the official line were once inside the Lamb family itself. In the end, maybe that's what hurts the most, because the message was always polished. There's nothing to see here. No wrongdoing, just lies from a bitter son and his wife. Over and over, Joni said it, with confidence. On air, on record, But if the truth is more complicated, and it always is, then the letter was just the first crack in a much bigger story, a story that may never fully be told. But we've seen enough now to stop pretending it's all just a misunderstanding. It was too easy to understand at first. The story was neat. Two people, Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, were angry, emotional, bitter. They had turned on their family. That was the version we were given. Simple, reassuring, but it was a lie. Daystar's official statements were carefully worded. They said Pete had cooperated with the police at every step, that there was no evidence, no proof of wrongdoing. They pointed to the temporary pause in the investigation as if it were divine validation. God cleared his name, they said, but the truth didn't match the words. Police sources said the case wasn't over. Not truly. Not in the way Daystar wanted people to believe. The child, Jonathan and Suzy's daughter, was still struggling to speak about what happened. The lead investigator even said it directly. Pete Lamb was not cleared. He was not safe from the suspicion. That statement alone unraveled Daystar's version of events. Then came the letter, the one from Jonathan Weiss, Joni Lamb's own son-in-law. In his written report, Weiss described what he saw, Pete hugging and kissing that young girl, in ways that disturbed him. He didn't say it was a misunderstanding, he didn't excuse it, he documented it, and he sent that letter to the board of Daystar. That wasn't gossip, that wasn't rumor, that was family. This wasn't just Jonathan and Suzy anymore. Now there were at least two couples in the Lamb family, Jonathan and Suzy, and Jonathan Weiss and Rebecca, who had seen enough to be afraid. The story we were sold, the one where only two people ever had concerns, didn't hold water anymore. The clean narrative cracked open, and behind the scenes the cracks went deeper. Daystar told the public the case was closed, but in truth, it was only paused. And in 2025, it reopened. That's not exoneration, that's delay. A delay caused by the trauma of a child, not the innocence of a man. But none of that made it into the press releases. Those were written to protect the brand. Inside the ministry, things were unraveling too. Jonathan Lamb wasn't just quietly pushed aside, he was demoted, then given an NDA. When he refused to sign it, he was fired. Officially, it was for poor performance. Unofficially, it was for refusing to keep quiet about what he believed was abuse. This wasn't a slight difference between perception and reality. This was a different story altogether. Daystar crafted its version of events with precision, enough clarity to sound factual, but never enough to tell the full truth. The aim was simple: make it easy for supporters to believe. And they did. They wanted to. But the truth was messy. It was filled with contradictions, police reports, private letters, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. It was full of pain. This is where spin becomes something more dangerous. When a ministry claims moral authority but bends the truth to protect its image, it betrays the very trust it asked for. What Daystar offered wasn't just PR, it was a controlled story. And the more you look at the facts, the more deliberate that control seems. The biggest betrayal wasn't just of public trust. It was of the people inside who believed the story, who tithed, who prayed, who followed. People who find out now that not everything was as it seemed. Because when one version of a story leaves out the voices of concerned family members, like JW and Rebecca, and another version is backed up by first-hand reports and private discussions, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Was the truth hidden on purpose? For some, the revelations validated what they already suspected. For others, the ones who genuinely believed the ministry story, JW's letter was a wake-up call. You can't unring a bell like that, and once you hear it, you can't go back to believing the easy version without asking what else they left out. The difference between the official story and the truth wasn't just one of tone, it was a matter of who got protected and who got punished. Because when Jonathan and Suzy spoke out, they lost everything: their jobs, their money, their future at Daystar. They were painted as traitors, accused of trying to tear the family apart. Meanwhile, those who stayed silent, they stayed at the table, kept their seats, kept their names clean. But silence is its own kind of weight, and silence has consequences. The way people tell the story depends on who holds the mic. Daystar's statements were clean, polished, and convincing. And because the other voices, like JW's, weren't public, it was easy to pretend they didn't exist. Easy to believe that Jonathan and Suzy were just the outliers. But keeping one version of the truth in the spotlight while burying the other isn't just bias. It's a strategy. And over time, the truth has a way of leaking through. JW's letter, the reopened investigation, private family conflicts that didn't match public unity. The story Daystar told began to break apart under the weight of the facts. And with every crack, those who stayed silent had more to explain, even if they still aren't speaking. Why? Because telling the truth always costs something, and people in power rarely like paying that price. When you tell the truth, you give up the ability to control how others see you. You risk losing donors, audience, influence. And for many ministries, just like many businesses and political machines, control is everything. They tell themselves that protecting the brand is protecting the mission. But it's not. Most of the time, it's just about protecting the powerful. That's why when Jonathan and Suzy chose to speak, it wasn't just brave. It was costly. They gave up their income, their status, and their comfort. But they held on to the one thing they could still stand on, the truth. And in doing so, they exposed how fragile the system really was. Because this isn't just a Daystar problem. It's a human one. In any system where image is more valuable than integrity, silence becomes currency. The cost of speaking out is high, but the cost of staying silent? That's paid by the innocent. In this case, the child at the center of it all. That's the part no one likes to talk about. That's the part the PR never included. That's the reality beneath all the spin. Someone vulnerable was hurt, and the people who could have protected her chose the institution instead. At the heart of this story is one hard, heavy truth. Silence isn't neutral. It either hides the truth or hides the lie. And when a billion-dollar ministry keeps the truth behind closed doors, the weight of that silence doesn't fall on those at the top. It falls on the ones who never had a voice to begin with.